I can't impose on you the gravity of the situation. The pressure on the soil was intensified by the fact that 60% of China was over 6,000 feet above sea level, too high for cultivation, while more than half the land had inadequate rainfall, below 20 inches a year. Moreover, the rainfall was provided by the erratic monsoon winds, which frequently brought floods and occasionally failed completely, causing wholesale famine. In the United States, 140 million people were supported by the labor of 6.5 million farmers on 365 million acres of cultivated land in 1945. China, about the same time, had almost 500 million persons supported by the labor of 65 million farmers on only 217 million acres of cultivated land. In China, the average farm was only a little over 4 acres compared to 157 in the United States, but was divided into 5 or 6 separate fields and had, on the average, 6.2 persons living on it, compared to 4.2 persons on the immensely larger American farm. As a result, in China there was only about half an acre of land for each person living on the land, compared to the American figure of 15.7 acres per person. As a consequence of this pressure on the land, the average Chinese peasant had, even in earlier times, no margin above the subsistence level, especially when we recall that a certain part of his income flowed upward to the upper classes, since on his agricultural account alone the average Chinese peasant was below the subsistence level. They had to use various ingenious devices to get up to that level. All purchases of goods produced off the farm were kept at an absolute minimum. Every wisp of grass, fallen leaf, or crop residue was collected to serve as fuel. All human waste products, including those of the cities, were carefully collected and restored to the soil as fertilizer. For this reason, farmlands around cities, because of the greater supply of such wastes, were more productive than more remote farms, which were dependent on local supplies of such human wastes. Collection and sale of such wastes became an important link in the agricultural economics of China. Since the human digestive system extracts only part of the nutritive elements in food, the remaining elements were frequently extracted by feeding such wastes to swine, thus passing them through the pig's digestive system before these wastes returned to the soil to provide nourishment for new crops and thus for new food. Every peasant farm had at least one pig which was purchased young, lived in the farm latrine until it was full grown, and then was sold into the city to provide a cash margin for such necessary purchases as salt, sugar, oils, or iron products. In a somewhat similar way, the rice paddy was able to contribute to the farmer's supply of proteins by acting as a fish pond and an aquarium for minute freshwater shrimp. In China, as in Europe, the aims of agricultural efficiency were quite different from the aims of agricultural efficiency in new countries such as the United States, Canada, Argentina, or Australia. In these newer countries there was a shortage of labor and a surplus of land, while in Europe and Asia there was a shortage of land and a surplus of labor. Accordingly, the aim of agricultural efficiency in newer lands was high output of crops per unit of labor. It was for this reason that American agriculture put such emphasis on labor-saving agricultural machinery and soil-exhausting agricultural practices, while Asiatic agriculture put immense amounts of hand labor on small amounts of land in order to save the soil and to win the maximum crop from the limited amount of land. In America, the farmer could afford to spend large sums for farm machinery, because the labor for such machinery replaced would have been expensive anyway, and because the cost of that machinery was spread over such a large acreage that its cost per acre was relatively moderate. In Asia there was no capital for such expenditures on machinery, because there was no margin of surplus above subsistence in the hands of the peasantry, and because the average farm was so small that the cost of machinery per acre, either to buy or even to operate, would have been prohibitive. The only surplus in Asia was of labor, and every effort was made, by putting more and more labor on the land, to make the limited amount of land more productive. One result of this investment of labor in land in China can be seen in the fact that about half of the Chinese farm acreage was irrigated, while about a quarter of it was terraced. Another result of this excess concentration of labor on land was that such labor was underemployed and semi-idle for about 3/4 of the year, being fully busy only in the planting and harvest seasons. From this semi-idleness of the Asiatic rural population came the most important effort to supplement peasant incomes through rural handicrafts. Before we turn to this crucial point, we should glance at the relative success of China's efforts to achieve high unit yields in agriculture. In the United States, about 1940, each acre of wheat required 1.2 man-days of work each year. In China, an acre of wheat took 26 man-days of labor. The rewards of such expenditures of labor were quite different. In China, the output of grain for each man-year of labor was 3,080 pounds. In the United States, the output was 44,000 pounds per man-year of labor. This low productivity of agricultural labor in China would have been perfectly acceptable if China had instead achieved high output per acre. Unfortunately, even in this alternative aim, China was only moderately successful. More successful than the United States, it is true, but far less successful than European countries which aimed at the same type of agricultural efficiency, high yields per acre, as China did. This can be seen from the following figures. Then we have output per acre in rice. In the United States it was 47 bushels. In China it was 67 bushels per acre, and in Italy it was 93 bushels. In wheat it was 14 bushels in the United States. In China it was 16 bushels, and in England it was 32 bushels per acre. These figures indicate the relative failure of Chinese and other Asiatic agriculture, even in terms of its own aims. This relative failure was not caused by lack of effort, but by such factors as 1. Farms too small for efficient operation, 2. Excessive population pressure which forced farming onto less productive soil and which drew more nutritive elements out of the soil than could be replaced, even by wholesale use of human wastes as fertilizer. 3. Lack of such scientific agricultural techniques as seed selection or crop rotation. And 4. The erratic character of a monsoon climate on a deforested and semi-eroded land. Because of the relatively low productivity of Chinese and all Asiatic agriculture, the whole population was close to the margin of subsistence, and at irregular intervals was forced below that margin into widespread famine. In China, the situation was alleviated to some extent by 3 forces. In the first place, the irregular famines, which we have mentioned, and somewhat more frequent onslaughts of plague disease, kept the population within manageable bounds. These 2 irregular occurrences reduced the population by millions in both China and India when they occurred. Even in ordinary years, the death rate was high, about 30 per thousand in China, compared to 25 in India, 12.3 in England, or 8.7 in Australia. Infant mortality in the first year of life was about 159 per thousand in China, compared to 240 in India, about 70 in Western Europe, and about 32 in New Zealand. At birth, an infant could be expected to live less than 27 years in India, less than 35 years in China, about 60 years in England or the United States, and about 66 years in New Zealand. All figures are about 1930. In spite of this, quote, expectation of death, end quote, in China, the population was maintained at a high level by a birth rate of about 38 per thousand of the population, compared to 34 in India, 18 in the United States or Australia, and 15 in England. The skyrocketing effect which the use of modern sanitary or medical practices might have upon China's population figures can be gathered from the fact that about 3/4 of Chinese deaths are from causes which are preventable, usually easily preventable, in the West. For example, a quarter of all deaths are from diseases spread by human wastes. About 10% come from childhood diseases like smallpox, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough. About 15% arise from tuberculosis, and about 7% are in childbirth. The birth rate was kept up in traditional Chinese society as a consequence of a group of ideas which are usually known as ancestor worship. Every Chinese family had as its most powerful motivation the conviction that the family line must be continued in order to have descendants to keep up the family shrines, to maintain the ancestral graves, and to support the living members of the family after their productive years had ended. The expense of such shrines, graves, and old persons was a considerable burden on the average Chinese family, and a cumulative burden as well, since the diligence of earlier generations frequently left a family with shrines and graves so elaborate that upkeep alone was a heavy expense to later generations. At the same time, the urge to have sons kept the birth rate up and led to such undesirable social practices in traditional Chinese society as infanticide, abandonment, or sale of female offspring. Another consequence of these ideas was that more well-to-do families in China tended to have more children than poor families. This was the exact opposite of the situation in Western civilization, where a rise in the economic scale resulted in the acquisition of a middle-class outlook which included restriction of the family's offspring. The pressure of China's population on the level of subsistence was relieved to some extent by wholesale Chinese emigration in the period after 1800. This outward movement was toward the less settled areas of Manchuria, Mongolia, and southwestern China, overseas to America and Europe, and above all to the tropical areas of southeastern Asia, especially to Malaya and Indonesia. In these areas, the diligence, frugality, and shrewdness of the Chinese provided them with a good living, and in some cases with considerable wealth. They generally acted as a commercial middle class, pushing inward between the native Malaysian or Indonesian peasants and the upper group of ruling whites. This movement, which began centuries ago, steadily accelerated after 1900 and gave rise to unfavorable reactions from the non-Chinese residents of these areas. The Malays, Siamese, and Indonesians, for example, came to regard the Chinese as economically oppressive and exploitative, while the white rulers of these areas, especially in Australia and New Zealand, regarded them with suspicion for political and racial reasons. Among the causes of this political suspicion were the emigrant Chinese remained loyal to their families at home and to the homeland itself, that they were generally excluded from citizenship in areas to which they emigrated, and that they continued to be regarded as citizens by successive Chinese governments. The loyalty of emigrant Chinese to their families at home became an important source of economic strength to these families and to China itself, because emigrant Chinese sent very large savings back to their families. We have already mentioned the important role played by peasant handicrafts in traditional Chinese society. It would perhaps not be any real exaggeration to say that peasant handicrafts were the factor which permitted the traditional form of society to continue, not only in China but in all of Asia. This society was based on an inefficient agricultural system in which the political, military, legal, and economic claims of the upper classes drained from the peasantry such a large proportion of their agricultural produce that the peasant was kept pressed down to the subsistence level, and in much of China below this level. Only by this process could Asia support its large urban populations and its large numbers of rulers, soldiers, bureaucrats, traders, priests, and scholars, none of whom produced the food, clothing, or shelter they were consuming. In all Asiatic countries, the peasants on the land were underemployed in agricultural activities because of the seasonal nature of their work. In the course of time, there had grown up a solution to this social agrarian problem. In their spare time, the peasantry occupied themselves with handicrafts and other non-agricultural activities, and then sell the products of their labor to the cities for money, to be used to buy necessities. In real terms, this meant that the agricultural products, which were flowing from the peasantry to the upper classes, and generally from rural areas to the cities, were replaced in part by handicrafts, leaving a somewhat larger share of the peasants' agricultural products in the hands of peasants. It was this arrangement which made it possible for the Chinese peasantry to raise their incomes up to the subsistence level. The importance of this relationship should be obvious. If it were destroyed, the peasant would be faced with a cruel alternative. Either he could perish by falling below the subsistence level, or he could turn to violence in order to reduce the claims which the upper classes had on his agricultural products. In the long run, every peasant group was driven toward the second of these alternatives. As a result, all Asia by 1940 was in the grip of a profound political and social upheaval, because a generation earlier, the demand for the products of peasants' handicrafts had been reduced. The destruction of this delicately balanced system occurred when cheap machine-made products of Western manufacture began to flow into Asiatic countries. Native products such as textiles, metal goods, paper, wood carvings, pottery, hats, baskets, and such found it increasingly difficult to compete with Western manufactures in the markets of their own cities. As a result, the peasantry found it increasingly difficult to shift the legal and economic claims which the upper urban classes held against them from agricultural products to handicraft products. And as a consequence of this, the percentage of their agricultural products which was being taken from the peasantry by the claims of other classes began to rise. This destruction of the local market for native handicrafts could have been prevented if high customs duties had been imposed on European industrial goods. But one point on which the European powers were agreed was that they would not allow backward countries to exclude their products with tariffs. In India, Indonesia, and some of the lesser states of Southeastern Asia, this was prevented by the European powers taking over the government of the areas. In China, Egypt, Turkey, Persia, and some Malay states, the European powers took over no more than the financial system or the customs service. As a result, countries like China, Japan, and Turkey had to sign treaties maintaining their tariffs at 5 or 6 or 8% and allowing Europeans to control these services. Sir Robert Hart, whom the Empress Cixi called My Heart, was head of the Chinese customs from 1863 to 1906, just as Sir Evelyn Baring, Lord Cromer, was head of the Egyptian financial system from 1879 to 1907, and Sir Edgar Vincent, Lord Darwin, was the chief figure in the Turkish financial system from 1882 to 1897. As a consequence of the factors we have described, the position of the Chinese peasant was desperate by 1900 and became steadily worse. A moderate estimate, published in 1940, showed that 10% of the farm population owned 53% of the cultivated land, while the other 90% had only 47% of the land. The majority of Chinese farmers had to rent at least some land, for which they paid as rent from 1/3 to 1/2 of the crop. Since their incomes were not adequate, more than half of all Chinese farmers had to borrow each year. On borrowed grain, the interest rate was 85% a year. On money loans, the interest was variable, being over 20% a year, or 9/10 of all loans made, and over 50% a year on 1/8 of the loans made. Under such conditions of land ownership, rental rates and interest charges, the future was hopeless for the majority of Chinese farmers long before 1940. Yet the social revolution in China did not come until after 1940. The slow growth of the social revolution in China was the result of many influences. Chinese population pressure was relieved to some extent in the last half of the 19th century by the famines of 1877 to 1879, which killed about 12 million people, by the political disturbances of the Taiping and other rebellions in 1848 to 1875, which depopulated large areas, and by the continued high death rate. The continued influence of traditional ideas, especially Confucianism and respect for ancestral ways, held the lid on this boiling pot until this influence was destroyed in the period after 1900. Hope that some solution might be found by the Republican regime after the collapse of the imperial regime in 1911 had a similar effect. And lastly, the distribution of European weapons in Chinese society was such as to hinder rather than to assist revolution until well into the 20th century. Then this distribution turned in a direction quite different from that in Western civilization. These last 3 points are sufficiently important to warrant a closer examination. We have already mentioned that effective weapons which are difficult to use or expensive to obtain encourage the development of authoritarian regimes in any society. In the late medieval period, in Asia, cavalry provided such a weapon. Since the most effective cavalry was that of the pastoral Ural-Altaic-speaking peoples of Central Asia, these peoples were able to conquer the peasant peoples of Russia, of Anatolia, of India, and of China. In the course of time, the alien regimes of 3 of these areas, not in Russia, were able to strengthen their authority by the acquisition of effective and expensive artillery. In Russia, the princes of Moscow, having been the agents of the Mongols, replaced them by becoming their imitators, and made the same transition to a mercenary army, based on cavalry and artillery, as the backbone of a ruling despotism. In Western civilization, similar despotisms, but based on infantry and artillery, were controlled by figures like Louis XIV, Frederick the Great, or Gustavus Adolphus. In Western civilization, however, the agricultural revolution after 1725 raised standards of living, while the industrial revolution after 1800 so lowered the cost of firearms that the ordinary citizen of Western Europe and of North America could acquire the most effective weapon existing, the musket. As a result of this, and other factors, democracy came to these areas, along with mass armies of citizen soldiers. This is not quite true. In Central and Southern Europe, where the agricultural and industrial revolutions came late or not at all, the victory of democracy was also late and incomplete. In Asia generally, the revolution in weapons, meaning muskets and later rifles, came before the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution. Indeed, most firearms were not locally made, but were imported, and being imported, came into the possession of the upper class of rulers, bureaucrats, and landlords, and not into the hands of peasants or city masses. As a result, these ruling groups were generally able to maintain their position against their own masses when they could not defend themselves against European powers. As a consequence of this, any hope of partial reform or of a successful revolution early enough to be a moderate revolution became quite unlikely. In Russia and in Turkey, it required defeat in a foreign war with European states to destroy the corrupt imperial regimes, 1917 to 1921. Earlier, the Tsar had been able to crush the revolt of 1905 because the army remained loyal to the regime, while the Sultan in 1908 had to yield to a reform movement because it was supported by the army. In India, Malaya, and Indonesia, the disarmed native peoples offered no threat of revolt to the ruling European powers before 1940. In Japan, the army, as we shall see, remained loyal to the regime and was able to dominate events so that no revolution was conceivable before 1940. But in China, the trend of events was much more complex. In China, the people could not get weapons because of their low standards of living and the high cost of imported arms. As a result, power remained in the hands of the army, except for small groups who were financed by immigrant Chinese with relatively high incomes overseas. By 1911, the prestige of the imperial regime had fallen so low that it obtained support from almost no one, and the army refused to sustain it. As a result, the revolutionaries, supported by overseas money, were able to overthrow the imperial regime in an almost bloodless revolution, but were not able to control the army after they had technically come to power. The army, leaving the politicians to squabble over forms of government or areas of jurisdiction, became independent political powers, loyal to their own chiefs, warlords, and supported themselves and maintained their supply of imported arms by exploiting the peasantry of the provinces. The result was a period of warlordism from 1920 to 1941. In this period, the Republican government was in nominal control of the whole country, but was actually in control only of the seacoast and river valleys, chiefly in the south, while various warlords operating as bandits were in control of the interior and most of the north. In order to restore its control to the whole country, the Republican regime needed money and imported arms. Accordingly, it tried two expedients in sequence. The first expedient, in the period 1920 to 1927, sought to restore its power in China by obtaining financial and military support from foreign countries, Western countries, Japan or Soviet Russia. This expedient failed, either because these foreign powers were unwilling to assist, or, in the case of Japan and Soviet Russia, were willing to help only on terms which would have ended China's independent political status. As a consequence, after 1927, the Republican regime underwent a profound change, shifting from a democratic to an authoritarian organization, changing its name from Republican to Nationalist, and seeking the money and arms to restore its control over the country by making an alliance with the landlord, commercial, and banking classes of the eastern Chinese cities. These property classes could provide the Republican regime with the money to obtain foreign arms in order to fight the warlords of the West and North. But these groups would not support any Republican effort to deal with the social and economic problems facing the great mass of the Chinese people. While the Republican armies and the warlords were struggling with each other over the prostrate backs of the Chinese masses, the Japanese attacked China in 1931 and 1937. In order to resist the Japanese, it became necessary after 1940 to arm the Chinese masses. This arming of the masses of Chinese in order to defeat Japan in 1941–45 made it impossible to continue the Republican regime after 1945 so long as it continued to be allied with the upper economic and social groups in China, since the masses regarded these groups as exploiters. At the same time, changes to more expensive and more complex weapons made it impossible either for warlordism to revive or for the Chinese masses to use their weapons to establish a democratic regime. The new weapons, like airplanes and tanks, could not be supported by peasants on a provincial basis, nor could they be operated by peasants. The former fact ended warlordism, while the latter fact ended any possibility of democracy. In view of the low productivity of Chinese agriculture and the difficulty of accumulating sufficient capital either to buy or to manufacture such expensive weapons, these weapons in either way could be acquired only by a government in control of most of China and could be used only by a professional army loyal to that government. Under such conditions, it was to be expected that such a government would be authoritarian and would continue to exploit the peasantry in order to accumulate capital either to buy such weapons abroad or to industrialize enough to make them at home, or both. From this point of view, the history of China in the 20th century presents 5 phases, as follows. 1. The collapse of the imperial regime to 1911. 2. The failure of the Republic 1911–1920. 3. The struggle with warlordism 1920–1941, which has subdivisions. A. Efforts to obtain support abroad 1920–1927, and B. Efforts to obtain support from the property groups 1927–1941. 4. The struggle with Japan 1931–1945, and 5. The authoritarian triumph 1945 to the present day. The collapse of the imperial regime has already been discussed as a political and economic development. It was also an ideological development. The authoritarian and traditionalist ideology of the old China, in which social conservatism, Confucianist philosophy, and ancestor worship were intimately blended together, was well fitted to resist the intrusion of new ideas and new patterns of action. The failure of the imperial regime to resist the military, economic, and political penetration of Western civilization gave a fatal blow to this ideology. New ideas of Western origin were introduced, at first by Christian missionaries and later by Chinese students who had studied abroad. By 1900, there were thousands of such students. They had acquired Western ideas which were completely incompatible with the older Chinese system. In general, such Western ideas were not traditionalists or authoritarian and were thus destructive to the Chinese patriarchal family, to ancestor worship, or to the imperial autocracy. The students brought back from abroad Western ideas of science, of democracy, of parliamentarianism, of empiricism, of self-reliance, of liberalism, of individualism, and of pragmatism. Their possession of such ideas made it impossible for them to fit into their own country. As a result, they attempted to change it, developing a revolutionary fervor, which merged with the anti-dynastic secret societies which had existed in China since the Manchus took over the country in 1644. Japan's victory over China in 1894 to 1895 in a war arising from a dispute over Korea, and especially the Japanese victory over Russia in the War of 1904 to 1905, gave a greater impetus to the revolutionary spirit in China, because these events seemed to share that an Oriental country could adopt Western techniques successfully. The failure of the Boxer movement in 1900 to expel Westerners without using such Western techniques also increased the revolutionary fervor in China. As a consequence of such events, the supporters of the imperial regime began to lose faith in their own system and in their own ideology. They began to install piecemeal, hesitant, and ineffective reforms, which disrupted the imperial system without in any way strengthening it. Marriage between Manchu and Chinese was sanctioned for the first time in 1902. Manchuria was opened to settlement by Chinese in 1907. The system of imperial examinations based on the old literary scholarship for admission to the civil service and the mandarinate were abolished, and a Ministry of Education, copied from Japan, was established in 1905. A drafted constitution was published providing for provincial assemblies and a future national parliament 1908, and the law was codified in 1910. These concessions did not strengthen the imperial regime, but merely intensified the revolutionary feeling. The death of the emperor and of Dowager Empress Cixi, who had been the real ruler of the country in 1908, brought to the throne a 2-year-old child, Po Yi. The reactionary elements made use of the regency to obstruct reform, dismissing the conservative reform minister Yuan Shikai, 1859 to 1916, a discovery of the headquarters of the revolutionists at Hankow in 1911 precipitated the revolution. While Dr. Sun Yat-sen, 1866 to 1925, hurried back to China from abroad, I think it was from Japan, whence he had directed the revolutionary movement for many years, the tottering imperial regime recalled Yuan Shikai to take command of the anti-revolutionary armies. Instead, he cooperated with the revolutionists, forced the abdication of the Manchu dynasty, and plotted to have himself elected as president of the Chinese Republic. Sun Yat-sen, who had already been elected provisional president by the National Assembly at Nanjing, accepted this situation, retiring from office and calling on all Chinese to support President Yuan. The contrast between Dr. Sun and General Yuan, the first and second presidents of the Chinese Republic, was as sharp as could be. Dr. Sun was a believer in Western ideas, especially in science, democracy, parliamentary government, and socialism, and had lived for most of his life as an exile overseas. He was self-sacrificing, idealistic, and somewhat impractical. General Yuan, on the other hand, was purely Chinese, a product of imperial bureaucracy, who had no knowledge of Western ideas and no faith in either democracy or parliamentary government. He was vigorous, corrupt, realistic, and ambitious. The real basis of his power rested in the new westernized army, which he had built up as a Governor-General of Qili in 1901 to 1907. In this force there were 5 divisions, well trained and completely loyal to Yuan. The officers of these units had been picked and trained by Yuan and played principal roles in Chinese politics after 1916. As president, Yuan opposed almost everything for which Dr. Sun had dreamed. He expanded the army, bribed politicians, and eliminated those who could not be bribed. The chief support of his policies came from a £25 million loan from Britain, France, Russia, and Japan in 1913. This made him independent of the Assembly and of Dr. Sun's political party, the Kuomintang, which dominated the Assembly. In 1913, one element of Sun's followers revolted against Yuan but were crushed. Yuan dissolved the Kuomintang, arrested its members, dismissed the parliament, and revised the constitution to give himself dictatorial powers as president for life, with a right to name his own successor. He was arranging to have himself proclaimed emperor when he died in 1916. As soon as Yuan died, the military leaders stationed in various parts of the country began to consolidate their power on a local basis. One of them even restored the Manchu dynasty, but it was removed again within 2 weeks. By the end of 1916, China was under the nominal rule of two governments, one at Beijing under Feng Kuo-chang, one of Yuan's militarists, and a secession government at Canton under Dr. Sun. Both of these functioned under a series of fluctuating paper constitutions, but the real power of both was based on the loyalty of local armies. Because in both cases the armies of more remote areas were semi-independent, government in those areas was a matter of negotiation, rather than of commands from the capital. Even Dr. Sun saw this situation sufficiently clearly to organize the Cantonese government as a military system with himself as generalissimo in 1917. Dr. Sun was so unfitted for this military post that on 2 occasions he had to flee from his own generals to security in the French concession at Shanghai, 1918 and 1922. Under such conditions, Dr. Sun was unable to achieve any of his pet schemes, such as the vigorous political education of the Chinese people, a widespread network of Chinese railways built with foreign capital, or the industrialization of China on a socialist basis. Instead, by 1920, warlordism was supreme, and the westernized Chinese found opportunity to exercise their new knowledge only in education and in the diplomatic service. Within China itself, command of a well-drilled army of control of a compact group of local provinces was far more valuable than any westernized knowledge acquired as a student abroad.